On the morning of June 13, 2026, an operation unfolded far from global headlines, deep within the dense and isolated terrain of Venezuela. There were no warnings, no visible buildup, and no immediate noise that could signal what was about to happen. Then, within seconds, a small green-roofed structure vanished under a controlled strike. That building was not random, it served as a discrete command point for Rodolfo Guerrero Flores, widely known as Nino Guerrero, the figure who orchestrated one of the most expansive criminal networks in the region, Tren de Aragua. This organization was never just another gang operating in the shadows. It had already evolved into a transnational system with thousands of members embedded across multiple countries. Its operations were structured, coordinated, and highly adaptable, covering activities such as contract killings, human trafficking routes, extortion, chains, and large-scale narcotics distribution. The scale alone made it difficult to contain, but what made it more dangerous was its ability to operate quietly, blending into different regions without drawing consistent attention. Behind the structure of this network were countless victims who rarely made it into official records. People disappeared, families were left without answers, and entire communities were affected without ever becoming part of global discourse. This is what shaped the context of the operation. It was not symbolic, and it was not rushed. It was built on the understanding that removing a central figure required precision, certainty, and timing that could not afford failure. The biggest complication was not identifying the target, it was reaching it. The location itself presented multiple layers of difficulty. Deep jungle terrain meant limited visibility, unpredictable movement patterns, and no conventional infrastructure. There were no nearby military bases to support direct deployment, and more importantly, no legal access to the airspace above the area. Any visible military intrusion, especially with conventional aircraft, could escalate into a diplomatic issue within minutes. Because of these limitations, the operation had to be designed differently. Instead of relying on speed, it relied on patience. Surveillance began long before the strike itself. High-altitude drones were deployed to observe the region continuously, capturing movement, identifying patterns, and mapping the environment in detail. This was not a short-term observation, it took time to understand routines, timing, and behavior within the target zone. Once enough information had been collected, the operation shifted into a more focused phase. Armed drones moved into closer monitoring positions, tracking specific activity around the structure. Every movement mattered, entry points, exit timing, and daily cycles were all analyzed. This level of detail was necessary to reduce uncertainty to the lowest possible level. At the same time, human intelligence sources on the ground provided real-time confirmation, ensuring that the individual targeted was indeed present at the exact moment required. Only after all these layers aligned was the final decision made. The strike itself was executed using a precision-guided missile designed to maximize internal structural damage. Instead of creating a wide external blast, the impact generated pressure that collapsed the building from within. The result was immediate and total. The structure did not simply burn or partially collapse, it was completely neutralized in seconds, leaving no functional remains. What makes this operation notable is not just the outcome, but the method behind it. It reflects a shift in how targeted actions are carried out, less visible, more calculated, and heavily dependent on data rather than force alone. Every stage, from surveillance to execution, required coordination, timing, and confirmation that had to align perfectly. There was no room for assumption and no margin for visible error. And honestly, if someone still thinks this kind of operation is just push a button and watch it explode, that's not just wrong, it's embarrassingly naive for something this calculated and controlled. The elimination of Guerrero created a shockwave, but it did not dismantle Tren de Aragua. What makes this organization difficult to break is not just its size, but the way it is built. Unlike traditional criminal groups that rely heavily on a strict chain of command, this network operates through a decentralized structure. Leadership exists, but it is not the single point holding everything together. Remove one figure and the system does not collapse, it adjusts. Across multiple regions, their operational cells function with a level of independence that allows continuity under pressure. These cells are not waiting for daily instructions from a central authority. They already have defined roles, established connections, and ongoing operations that can continue even when communication with leadership is disrupted. This is why taking out a top figure, while impactful, does not equal dismantling the organization itself. In countries far from its origin, including parts of North America and Europe, the network has already embedded itself into local systems. It blends into existing criminal ecosystems, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but always adapting. This flexibility makes it harder to isolate because it does not rely on one territory or one structure, it exists as a network rather than a single entity. That is exactly why operations like the strike-in must be understood as one layer of a much larger strategy. Physical elimination addresses visibility and command disruption, but it does not automatically touch the systems that keep the organization alive. The real engine behind operations like these is not just people, it is money. Every activity tied to the network generates revenue, and that revenue flows through complex channels designed to avoid detection. Shell companies, informal transfer systems, layered transactions, and asset conversions all play a role in keeping funds moving without drawing attention. These financial pathways are what sustain operations, pay members, and allow expansion into new regions. Targeting these financial structures requires a different kind of operation, one that involves tracking transactions, identifying patterns, and exposing connections that are deliberately hidden. It is slower, less visible, and often more complicated than direct action, but without it, the core of the network remains intact. At the same time, enforcement efforts must be coordinated across multiple jurisdictions. A network that operates across borders cannot be effectively weakened by isolated actions. If pressure is applied in one region but not in others, the system simply redistributes its activity. Consistency is what creates strain, and strain is what eventually leads to breakdown. However, maintaining that level of coordination is not simple. Political priorities shift, resources are limited, and attention often moves toward more immediate or visible issues. When that happens, long-term operations lose momentum, and organizations like this regain stability faster than expected. This is where most strategies fail, not in execution, but in follow-through. The initial strike creates momentum, but without sustained pressure on both operational and financial fronts, that momentum fades. History has shown this pattern repeatedly. Leadership is removed, temporary disruption follows, and then a new structure emerges. Often more cautious but still functional. Thinking that removing one leader means the entire system is finished isn't just wrong, it's the kind of shallow conclusion people make when they don't understand how resilient these networks are built to be. The strike-in can be classified as a clear tactical success, but only within a limited frame. Removing a figure like Guerrero creates immediate disruption at the top level of the network. Communication chains are interrupted, decision-making slows down, and internal uncertainty begins to spread. For a brief period, the organization is forced to pause, reassess, and reorganize. That window is critical, but it is also temporary. What matters far more than the strike itself is everything that comes after. A single operation, no matter how precise, does not define the outcome of a conflict like this. The real question is whether this moment is followed by sustained pressure or allowed to fade into silence. If there are coordinated follow-up actions targeting logistics, recruitment channels, transportation routes, and financial systems, then the initial disruption can evolve into something much larger. If not, the network simply stabilizes and continues under adjusted leadership. Another key factor is the role of local and regional cooperation. Operations like this do not happen in isolation. They rely on intelligence sharing agreements, access permissions, and political alignment between multiple actors. Those conditions are never permanent. A shift in leadership, policy, or national interest can quickly change the level of cooperation available. When that happens, future operations become more limited, less precise, and far more difficult to execute. At the same time, this event highlights how modern operations have shifted away from traditional large-scale military presence. The combination of long-term surveillance, real-time intelligence, and precision strike capability allows actions to be carried out with minimal visibility. It is not about overwhelming force anymore, it is about timing, accuracy, and information dominance. This approach reduces exposure, limits collateral impact, and increases the likelihood of mission success, but it also requires a level of coordination that cannot be maintained without consistent commitment. There is also the question of perception. From the outside, an operation like this can look definitive: a clean strike, a high-value target removed, and a narrative of success. But internally, within the network itself, the reaction is different. Systems like this are built with the expectation of loss. Contingency plans exist, replacements are prepared, and structures are designed to absorb impact. What appears as a decisive blow from one perspective may only register as a temporary setback from another. That is why the timeline after the strike becomes the most important indicator. If enforcement actions continue across multiple fronts, if financial networks are disrupted, and if regional cells begin to lose coordination, then the operation marks the beginning of a broader campaign. But if days turn into weeks without meaningful follow-up, the signal changes. It suggests that the strike was isolated, effective in execution, but limited in strategic depth. In conflicts like this, momentum is everything. Once it is lost, rebuilding it becomes significantly harder than maintaining it in the first place. The longer the gap between actions, the more time the network has to recover, adapt, and reinforce its structure. If this ends here and nothing follows, then this wasn't a turning point. It was just a momentary disruption that looks impressive on the surface but changes almost nothing underneath.